Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. Used for thousands of years by indigenous tribes of the Amazon rainforest, the mystical brew known as ayahuasca is now becoming popular in Western countries. This magical concoction, composed of two plants, contains DMT, a powerful psychedelic with amazing therapeutic potential, according to our guest today on Pathways. A growing list of celebrities, including Sting and Chelsea Handler, have publicly shared how ayahuasca experiences have improved their lives. There are countless such stories, many of which are dramatic and almost miraculous. People in search of ayahuasca tend to be well-educated, sophisticated, and have been labeled cultural creatives. Some are hoping for relief from psychiatric illnesses after failing to find help from Western medicine. Others are seeking personal healing, consciousness exploration, or a mystical experience. Our guest today is Dr. Rachel Harris, author of the new book, Listening to Ayahuasca, New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. She received the National Institutes of Health New Investigators Award, has published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals, and has worked as a psychological consultant to Fortune 500 companies and the United Nations. Her background includes careers as a research psychologist as well as a psychotherapist. Hello, Rachel, and welcome to the Pathways program.
Hi, Paul. I'm so pleased to be here.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for writing a brilliant book. As someone who's actually taken ayahuasca and has read a few other books on it, including at least one other one that was featured in a previous Pathways program, I found tremendous therapeutic value just in reading your book, and I think it must have value for anyone who is curious about the possible therapeutic uses of entheogenic drugs. So thank you very much for writing it.
I'm so pleased to hear that. That really is the hope that I have for the book, is that it's helpful to people. Even just thinking about ayahuasca, that it will help them make informed decisions.
Well, I love the way that you go beyond the actual ayahuasca experience to examine the after effects, which you did in a scientific research project that you put together. But before we get into that, let's talk about ayahuasca itself for our listeners who might not know much about it. Here we have at least two substances that are combined for a unique effect. And it's a very unique effect because if you smoke or inject DMT, it only lasts, from what I understand, I've never done it, but it only lasts like 10 or 15 minutes.
Yes.
And yet when you create this ayahuasca brew, it lasts for 3 or 4 hours. And I'm wondering, how on earth was that ever discovered? What do we know about how the indigenous people learned to combine these two plants out of all the plants in the jungle?
Yes, they have. That has often been the question that anthropologists ask. And this medicine has been used for thousands of years. I mean, I've seen reports that it's 4,000 years old or 8,000 years old. And when the indigenous people are asked, how did you know to combine these two plants that would release this psychedelic medicine, they would say the plants told us. So that opens up a whole cosmology that they have communication with plant spirits that teach them and basically give them guidance about finding new medicines in the jungle.
Okay, so how... I understand that the indigenous people have used it for a variety of purposes. Can you speak to that? How have they traditionally used it?
Well, they've used it for healing. I mean, they consider any health complaints to be spiritually based. So it's a spiritual medicine, and they basically use it to treat everything. But it's specific for parasites. It will remove parasites because there's often a purge included with the medicine, which means vomiting or diarrhea. So it will clean out the whole digestive tract. But it was also used to find lovers or to to find out who your lover was with. I mean, it was used for psychic reasons as well, and for finding animals in the jungle to know where to hunt.
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of an all-purpose medicine. It's very interesting that it's used in very different ways. But in the West, it's basically used for psychological and spiritual purposes.
Now, in the jungle, just to finish with that thought, how often would members of a tribe actually do ayahuasca?
You know, I have never seen that written about. I don't know that we know, and it has to be different for different tribes. They're individual cultures, and they must use it differently. So I really don't know that answer. I know when, I know a few Westerners who have spent decades studying, and so are full-fledged shaman. And when they appear in the villages where they were trained, people sort of come out of the jungle to do a ceremony with them. So people sort of line up for treatment.
I see.
And they work, the stories I've heard is they do night after night after night of treating everybody who comes out and wants to drink. So this is for medical healing purposes.
Now, as I said in our intro, you have a background not only as a therapist, but as a psychological researcher. And
Yes.
what inspired you to research ayahuasca?
Well, it was my own first experience was so powerful that I basically woke up the next morning with all kinds of questions. And they were mostly, I'm a researcher who asked therapy questions. So I was asking, how does this work? I mean, I was just basically blown away by what an experience I had. And I was with Indigenous shaman with a translator, and there was no way to talk about my therapy questions. I had Western questions, and the shaman had no interest and no clue. They don't know anything about therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So, to ask, how does this work? How is it so specifically such a healing experience? These were irrelevant and probably very stupid questions from this Western woman. So there was no answering them. So I focused the research in North America, asking what happened after the ceremony. Basically, what were the therapeutic benefits? How are you different? How has your life changed as a result of drinking this medicine?
So you wanted to see what people were doing to integrate the ayahuasca experiences into...
Yes. What were the benefits and how did they integrate? And my question ultimately is, how do we maximize those benefits?
Mm-hmm. And I want to say how grateful I am that you wrote such an easy-to-read book to distill what you learned. Now, how did you conduct the research that's behind the book?
Well, I limited it to people who had drunk ayahuasca once in North America, because there's no way to really have much control over this research, because it's I'm interviewing people who are in sort of an underground community of sorts, because the medicine is illegal in this country. So it was amazing how cooperative people were to complete this 16-page interview form and mostly essay questions. And they wrote me personal letters and gave me their phone number and email. People were very much wanting to share their experiences and to support research into a medicine that they felt was so helpful to them in their lives. So it's what's called a rolling admission. Somebody knew somebody, and my questionnaires got handed out. And 81 people completed the questionnaires, and then I interviewed another 50, and I have followed a good number of maybe half a dozen to a dozen. I have people, I followed them for years, up to 6 and 7 years. I continue to see them and hear how they're doing and what's new. As they look back on their experiences with ayahuasca, how did they see it from this vantage point? So it's an unusual project that's continued.
Now, initially, you were surprised to learn that other people shared the long-lasting effects that you had noticed in your own life. Isn't that right?
Yes, but what really surprised me the most is that three-quarters of the people who completed the questionnaire reported an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. And I asked them, well, how do you communicate? And people reported that they heard from her, they communicated with her in dreams, in meditation, in quiet moments, in nature, but that it was an ongoing relationship with the spirit. This is not exactly part of our Western culture. And it frankly was shocking that three-quarters of Westerners reported this experience.
That is fascinating, and I think it's fascinating that it's almost universally characterized as a feminine deity, if you will.
Yes.
Going back thousands of years in the middle of the rainforest. Speak to that. Why you call it? You refer to it as Grandmother Ayahuasca in the book.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I have to tell you, that's the hardest question I'm asked. And I asked that same question to two pretty famous religion professors, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And these professors gave me the same answer. I said, who is Grandmother Ayahuasca? And they each said separately and independently, we don't know. And so that's, when religion professors at that level, I felt they gave me permission to join them and say, well, I don't really know either, but I can say she's given me very good advice, and that's what people report. I mean, and there is a grandmotherly quality to her, where there was one 20-something young man reported very seriously. I mean, he didn't really have a sense of humor about this, but Grandmother Ayahuasca said to him, cut your hair and clean up your room. He reported this very seriously. I, of course, laughed. But that's very grandmotherly. So there's that quality to her. And people also report that they feel she's like a perfect therapist or a perfect parent. She's always available. They can tune into her. She's kind and loving and on your side and supportive. Even when she's harsh like that, it's in your own best interest.
I've heard it described as she can be a stern grandmother, and she can also be a very nurturing grandmother. And I know in my own experience, I was quite surprised in not expecting this, because I had taken psychedelics in the 70s, and you had too, right? I mean,
yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Other psychedelics like LSD and things like that.
Yes.
And I never had any experience like this where I actually felt like I was being held, like I was being cradled in a sense.
Yeah.
And I could so resonate with your book, which describes that in the stories of so many of the people. How would you compare ayahuasca to other psychedelics?
Well, let me just pause on that
Okay.
question. I'll get back to it. But this relationship is part of what's unique about ayahuasca. And I just don't want to miss this point about what a therapeutic relationship that is, and what a healing experience that is, to feel so truly loved. And it's an experience of being loved by Mother Nature, by Grandmother Ayahuasca, by the spirit of, the cosmic forces of the universe. It's a very profound feeling that I think really changes everything in our psychic architecture. The way we think of ourselves and live in the world. It makes a huge difference to feel loved at that level.
And now, how dangerous is ayahuasca?
Well, I can say in general, all of the psychedelics are challenging. And it's very important to be in a very safe situation and have somebody, a witness and a guide, to be there for you so that you're not alone. And also with ayahuasca specifically, the instructions are to be off of any antidepressants for at least 6 weeks. And then there are different dietary recommendations, and they're slightly different, but basically avoid pork and fermented foods, and certainly alcohol. And there's also a prohibition against sex, as they say, with yourself or anyone else for days before the ceremony and days after. So I don't know to what extent these are. Certainly, the no antidepressants is a biochemical issue, and that's a very important medical warning. But some of the others about food and diet, it could be cultural. I don't really know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All of the psychedelics work on the serotonin system, which is what antidepressants work on.
Now, taking ayahuasca would not exactly classify as a way to have fun, right?
No, not exactly. I mean, you want to have access to a bathroom, for one thing, which, kind of rules out a lot of music concerts. And also the purge, a high percentage of people vomit. So this is not a fun experience. And also there's real work that gets done, and people understand that this is a deep psychological experience, and people work hard during these ceremonies and then in those what I call the golden hours and days and weeks after the ceremony. There's an openness and a kind of moving around inside that you can work with psychologically, therapeutically.
Now, considering its illegal status, how accessible is ayahuasca in the United States?
Well, that's all about who you know, and even and so it's in terms of safety, it's very hard to know who to trust or to know even what is actually in the concoction. Is it really ayahuasca? Is there something else added to it? This is a buyer beware market. You have to be very, very careful.
Mm-hmm. Now, Westerners are turning to ayahuasca for the therapeutic benefits, right?
Well, for spiritual and therapeutic. It really is like a rocket boost in a sense of a psycho-spiritual path.
Mm-hmm. And I think the what's unique about your book is it doesn't just describe the experience from a first-person point of view, but it actually is designed to help ayahuasca users benefit therapeutically from their experience, and it also has value for therapists. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I very much hope that therapists will also use the book so that they get almost a template of how to work with spiritual experiences, actually, whether from ayahuasca or even spontaneous ones, or from other psychedelics. So there are some subtle differences in how a therapist would work with the normal problems with growing up families versus spiritual experiences. And therapists have to be able to differentiate those two levels.
Now, what therapeutic benefits has your research borne out?
Well, it's interesting. They really fall into a pattern. And one of the first ones is actually the one that you referred to, with this experience of feeling loved. And so there's a better sense of that I'm okay in the universe, that I have a right to exist. It's not that self-esteem, oh, I feel better, I think I look better, or anything like that. It's that a deep, deep sense of feeling loved and an increased capacity for self-compassion. And people also, and I would say that's really central. Another thing is people report improvement in mood, a reduction in depression and anxiety. And as a consequence of both these things, their interpersonal relationships improve. People are more available for authentic relationships. They value them more. They appreciate people more. There was one young man whose mother, I had a chance to hear from his mother, and his mother said he's more patient with me. He was only about 23. That's not easy with a son and a mother. But the mother appreciated the changes in him.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes people stop drinking immediately. It's, they wake up the next morning and they say, alcohol is a poison, I'm never touching it again. And this is true even for people who have been in trouble with alcohol.
Now, one of the other things that you mention in the book is instances of relief from addictions, not only alcoholism, and PTSD. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, people report reliving traumatic episodes in their life, and there are two two ways that they report it, and these two ways need to be worked with differently with a therapist. And one is they actually relive the traumatic experience. So they're actually in it, they're going through it again. Oftentimes they're recovering more information, they're experiencing it more directly. Maybe they've blocked some details and they regain them. So that's a pretty sometimes terrifying experience during a ceremony. The other way people report reliving a traumatic incident is with distance. It's almost as if they're watching a movie of what happened to them, but they're watching it as if it's on a screen and there's a more objective distance. And so they can watch their story, but with their adult brain and their adult presence. And often they can understand it from a different perspective and experience, again, compassion for themselves, and sometimes even some sense of compassion or understanding for the perpetrator.
You know, here's a quote from your book that bears on this. The healing capacity of the ayahuasca experience resides significantly in the plant's ability to evoke the painful experiences of childhood self while having those experiences witnessed by the empathic curiosity of the adult self. Quote, I went to all the sad places of my childhood, one participant shared, but I accompanied myself there with understanding and love.
Isn't that a wonderful statement?
That is so profound, and what a beautiful possibility. You know, you also speak in the book about our habits of mind and how these can be penetrated and released. Particularly this, I love the use of this word, ruminating. You know,
yes.
You say
we all know what that means.
Yeah, I'm going to quote the book here. Ruminating involves the endless and repetitive negative self-focus that doesn't lead to active problem solving.
Right.
It includes dysfunctional attitudes, hopelessness, pessimism, self-criticism, neediness, and dependency connected with an increased risk of anxiety and depression. It's not pleasant to realize that the neurological underpinnings of our sense of self rest on this running tape of negative thinking. I love that. The neurological underpinnings of our sense of self rest on rumination. Is that
bad news? We all know it. I mean, deep in our hearts, we know we do this. And evidently the research shows we spend like 60% of our consciousness is going over the same stuff again and again.
Oh, it's amazing.
It's amazing.
Oh, so ayahuasca helps us break that cycle. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. The colloquial term that's used is recalibration or reset. There's an opportunity, you know, these patterns are kind of opened up as a result of of drinking ayahuasca and even the other psychedelics as well. And so there's a chance to reprogram ourselves. And that's what's so golden about the next day and the next weeks. And that's the opportunity for psychotherapy to really say, you know, I don't need to be stuck. I can rethink this. I can think about this in a different way. I can change my old ways of being consciously. I have choices I didn't have before.
You know, one of the most exciting things in the book, from my point of view, was your examination of how ayahuasca can have a healing effect on attachment disorders. You know, so many people, I mean, they say half the population were not secure in their attachment to their primary caretaker, usually the mother, during the first 2 or 3 years of life. And here you have this mother, la madre, sometimes they call it, or the grandmother, and there's this possibility of forming some kind of relationship that is secure because of the feeling of being loved as a child of the universe or Mother Nature. I think the ramifications for healing attachment disorders must be pretty incredible.
That's exactly right. I think so too. And not much has been written about this yet. But there has been some writing about if people with insecure or anxious attachment marry somebody who's very secure, there's a healing that takes place in those marriages. And they labeled it earned, security, so that people kind of heal as a result of having such a kind and consistent partner. And I think the same possibility exists with this medicine. I know this from even my own Western point of view, this sounds crazy, but I think this is a therapeutic potential that could offer healing to many people.
Now, tell our listeners why you recommend going to a counselor after the ceremony, in light of the fact that it's very difficult to find a counselor who is ayahuasca savvy.
Yes, yes. And I hope, that gradually that changes over the next decade or so. I think there is, I can give you a great example. I interviewed a young woman, maybe 28 years old, and she had this wonderful experience with grandmother ayahuasca during the ceremony. She saw the spirit as an archetype of womanhood, and she was kind of discovering her own grown womanhood, and she's going on and on about this archetype. And I looked at her and I said, "How's your relationship with your mother?" And she burst into tears. Mm-hmm. Now, if she had not talked to a therapist, and that's, it was so obvious to probably any therapist, and she went home after that interview and talked with her mother. And there's that opportunity to realize this is not just an archetype. This is not just a spiritual experience. There's a psychological process and opportunity here as well. And so she had a chance to work on her relationship with her mother in a way she would have missed completely if she had not talked to a therapist.
Okay, well, we've just about run out of time here, and I want to give you an opportunity to offer our listeners one last takeaway or bit of advice.
Well, it's a combination of be very careful, and this is a miraculous healing medicine.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I wish we could talk a lot longer. We've pretty much run out of time, and I want to make sure that we tell our listeners about your website where they can go get more information about your book and your work in general. What is the best website?
The website is listeningtoayahuasca.com.
Listeningtoayahuasca.com. That's all one word, listening to ayahuasca. And most people have such a hard time spelling it. I'm going to spell it. It's Ayahuasca, ayahuasca.
Yes.
So listening to ayahuasca.com. Thank you very much for being with us today. I wish we could talk longer. It's just so fascinating, and I love your book.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks so much.
And for those who tuned in late, this is your Pathways host, Paul O'Brien, author of Great Decisions, Perfect Timing, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. In a second, I'll tell you how you can rewind and replay this entire interview anytime you want via the internet or as a podcast on iTunes and other servers. Today, we have been visiting with Dr. Rachel Harris, author of the book Listening to Ayahuasca, New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to the Pathways interview program, which is broadcast and streamed via KBOO.FM on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. USA Pacific Time. Podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are also available for free at divination.com, divination.com, and on iTunes and other podcast outlets. This is Paul O'Brien, reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Dr. Rachel Harris and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways experience.